The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished floors of Windsor Castle as King Charles prepared for what would become one of the most challenging days of his reign. He stood in his private study, adjusting his tie nervously, while reviewing the speech notes scattered across his mahogany desk. Today marked the anniversary of Queen Elizabeth's passing, and Charles had planned to deliver a heartfelt tribute that would honor his mother's memory while addressing the ongoing challenges facing the monarchy. Camilla entered the room with her usual composed demeanor, carrying a silver tray with Charles's morning tea. Her eyes immediately fell upon the speech papers, and her expression shifted slightly. She had been monitoring Charles's public appearances closely ever since he became king, particularly concerned about how his words might affect public perception of their marriage and her role as queen consort. "Darling, are you certain about including those particular memories about your mother?" Camilla asked, setting down the tray and picking up one of the pages. Her voice carried a subtle tension that Charles had learned to recognize over their years together. Charles looked up from his notes, slightly puzzled by her tone. The speech he had crafted was deeply personal, filled with intimate stories about his relationship with his mother and how her guidance had shaped his approach to kingship. He had spent weeks working on it, consulting with his private secretary, and even seeking input from William about certain family anecdotes. "Which memories concern you?" Charles replied, though he could sense where this conversation was heading. Camilla had always been protective of their public image, sometimes to a fault. Camilla pointed to a particular section where Charles had written about his mother's advice regarding marriage and duty. The passage touched on Elizabeth's understanding of complex family dynamics and how she had eventually come to accept Camilla into the family. While Charles intended it as a tribute to his mother's wisdom and forgiveness, Camilla worried it might resurrect old controversies about their relationship and Diana's memory. "This section here," she said, her finger tracing the lines. "It might be misinterpreted by the press. You know how they love to twist words, especially anything that mentions family relationships or the past." Charles felt his shoulders tense. He had anticipated this moment, knowing that Camilla would likely have concerns about the speech. However, he had hoped she would understand the importance of speaking authentically about his mother's legacy, even if it meant addressing difficult topics. "Camilla, this is about honoring my mother's memory," Charles said, his voice carrying a note of firmness. "These stories show her character, her ability to heal wounds and bring family together. The public needs to hear this side of her." But Camilla was not easily dissuaded. She had lived through decades of negative press coverage and public scrutiny. Every word spoken by the royal family was dissected and analyzed, often taken out of context to create sensational headlines. She had worked hard to establish herself as a respected queen consort, and the thought of anything that might undermine that progress filled her with anxiety. "I understand your intentions," she continued, moving closer to Charles. "But perhaps we could revise this section to focus more on her public service rather than personal family matters. The people want to remember her as their queen, not necessarily hear about private family conversations." Charles set down his pen and looked directly at his wife. He could see the genuine concern in her eyes, but he also felt a growing frustration. This speech was one of the most important he would give as king, and he needed to speak from his heart, not from a carefully calculated script designed to avoid any possible controversy. "My mother was not just a public figure," Charles said, his voice rising slightly. "She was a person with real relationships and real impact on her family. If I cannot speak honestly about who she was and what she meant to me, then what purpose does this anniversary serve?" The tension in the room was becoming palpable. Camilla could sense Charles's growing irritation, but she felt compelled to press her point. She knew the media landscape better than most, having been its target for so many years. Every word spoken by the royal family was scrutinized, particularly anything related to family dynamics or past relationships. Charles, I am not asking you to be dishonest, Camilla said, her own voice becoming more strained. I am asking you to be strategic. We have worked so hard to stabilize the monarchy's reputation. Why risk undermining that for the sake of a few personal anecdotes? Charles felt his patience beginning to wear thin. He understood Camilla's concerns, but he also felt that she was asking him to compromise his integrity as both a son and a king. The speech he had written was not just about sharing memories. It was about showing the public that the royal family was human, capable of growth, forgiveness, and genuine love. Strategy cannot always take precedence over truth, Charles replied, gathering up his papers. My mother taught me that authenticity, even when difficult, is what ultimately earns respect. Camilla realized that her approach was not working. Charles was becoming more determined to deliver the speech as written, and her objections were only strengthening his resolve. She decided to change tactics, moving from concerns about public perception to more personal appeals. Think about William and Harry, she said softly. How might they feel hearing these family stories shared so publicly? Some things are meant to remain private, within the family. This argument struck closer to home for Charles. His relationship with his sons, particularly Harry, had been strained in recent years. He genuinely worried about how his words might affect them, even though William had been consulted about the speech and had expressed support for its content. Charles paused, considering Camilla's words. He thought about his sons and their own struggles with public life and media attention. Harry had already shared his feelings about the family publicly through interviews and his memoir, while William had always preferred to keep family matters private. William reviewed the speech, Charles said finally. He supports what I have written. As for Harry, I cannot let fear of his reaction prevent me from honoring my mother appropriately. Camilla realized she was losing ground in their discussion. Charles was becoming more entrenched in his position, and her arguments were not swaying him. She felt a growing sense of urgency as the time for his departure approached. If she could not convince him to modify the speech, she feared the consequences for both their reputation and their relationship. The morning light had grown stronger, filling the study with a warm glow that contrasted sharply with the tension between husband and wife. Charles returned to his desk, making final notes on his speech, while Camilla stood nearby, clearly struggling with how to proceed. Their conversation was interrupted by a gentle knock on the door. Charles's private secretary entered, reminding him that the car would be ready in 30 minutes for his departure to Westminster Abbey, where he would deliver the tribute speech. The reminder added pressure to an already strained situation. Sir, the advance team has confirmed all arrangements, the secretary said. The press corps is already in position, and BBC will begin live coverage in 2 hours. Charles nodded, acknowledging the information while continuing to review his notes. Camilla felt the window of opportunity for changing his mind closing rapidly. She made one final attempt to influence his decision. Charles, please, she said, her voice carrying both urgency and affection. Could we not make just a few small changes? Keep the essence of what you want to say, but remove the sections that might be problematic? Charles looked up at his wife. Seeing both her love for him and her genuine fear about the potential consequences of his words, he felt torn between his desire to honor his mother authentically and his commitment to protecting his wife from further media scrutiny. The silence stretched between them as Charles wrestled with his decision. He could see the hope in Camilla's eyes that he might compromise, but he also felt the weight of responsibility to speak truthfully about his mother's legacy. The morning that had started with such promise was now filled with tension and uncertainty, setting the stage for even greater conflict to come. Charles closed his leather portfolio with a decisive snap, his decision made despite Camilla's continued protests. He had spent too many years compromising his authentic voice to please others. and he would not allow his tribute to his mother to become another calculated performance. The weight of his mother's memory and his duty as king outweighed his desire to avoid confrontation with his wife. "The speech will remain as written," Charles announced, his tone carrying the authority of his royal position. "I cannot and will not sanitize my memories of my mother to satisfy media concerns." Camilla's face flushed with a mixture of frustration and determination. She had not expected Charles to be so unmovable on this matter, and the approaching deadline only intensified her anxiety. She knew from experience how quickly a well-intentioned speech could be twisted into negative headlines, and she felt a responsibility to protect both Charles and the monarchy from potential damage. "Then I cannot support this decision," Camilla said, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. "If you insist on proceeding with this speech as written, I will need to distance myself from it publicly." Charles stopped in his tracks, stunned by what he interpreted as an ultimatum. In all their years together, Camilla had never threatened to publicly oppose him or withdraw her support. The implications of her statement hit him like a physical blow. A divided royal couple on such an important anniversary would create exactly the kind of scandal they were both trying to avoid. "What exactly are you saying?" Charles asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Camilla realized her words had been harsher than intended, but she felt trapped by the situation. Her protective instincts for their reputation and her fear of media backlash had pushed her to take a position that surprised even herself. "I am saying that if you deliver this speech, I cannot be seen as endorsing its contents," she replied, though her voice betrayed some uncertainty. "Perhaps it would be best if I were suddenly taken ill and unable to attend the ceremony." The suggestion that she might fake an illness to avoid being associated with his speech struck Charles as deeply manipulative. He felt betrayed by what seemed like an attempt to sabotage one of the most important speeches of his reign through emotional manipulation and public embarrassment. "You would abandon me on this day to make a point about speech content?" Charles's voice rose with disbelief and hurt. "You would create a scandal to prevent what you perceive as a potential scandal?" Camilla realized her approach had backfired dramatically. Instead of convincing Charles to modify his speech, she had created a rift between them that threatened to become public knowledge. She attempted to soften her position while still maintaining her core concerns. "Charles, I am not abandoning you," she said, reaching toward him. "I am trying to protect us both from making a mistake that we might regret for years to come." But Charles stepped away from her gesture, his trust shaken by what he saw as an attempt to manipulate him through threats of public embarrassment. He had faced opposition from Parliament, the press, and even members of his own family, but he had always counted on Camilla's unwavering support. "Protection through threats and manipulation is not protection at all," Charles replied coldly. "It is control disguised as concern." The atmosphere in the study had become arctic. Charles's private secretary, who had retreated to give them privacy, knocked again to remind them of the tight schedule. The sound seemed to emphasize the urgency of their situation and the impossibility of reaching a resolution in the time remaining. "Sir, I hate to interrupt, but we really must depart within the next 10 minutes to stay on schedule," the secretary called through the door. Charles looked at his wife, hoping to see some sign of retreat from her position, but Camilla's expression remained resolute. She genuinely believed that proceeding with the speech as written would harm them both, and she felt that dramatic action was necessary to prevent what she saw as a serious mistake. "Very well," Charles said finally. "If you choose not to attend, that is your decision. But I will not be blackmailed into changing a speech that honors my mother's memory." Camilla felt a moment of panic as she realized Charles was calling what he perceived as her bluff. She had hoped her threat would motivate him to reconsider, but instead, it had hardened his resolve. Now she faced the choice of following through on her ultimatum or backing down and appearing weak. "Charles, please do not force me into this position," she pleaded, her earlier confidence beginning to crack. "I am not forcing you into anything," Charles replied firmly. "You have created this position yourself, and now you must decide whether to honor your commitment to me and the monarchy or to carry through with your threats." The sound of a car engine starting in the courtyard below reminded them both that time was running short. Charles needed to leave immediately to maintain his schedule, and any delay would create additional problems with the media and the ceremony organizers. At that moment, William arrived at the castle for what was supposed to be a brief meeting with his father before the ceremony. He had come to offer his support and to review any final details about the tribute speech. Instead, he walked into a situation of intense conflict between his father and stepmother. William knocked on the study door and entered after hearing Charles's invitation. The tension in the room was immediately apparent to him. His father stood rigid with anger and hurt, while Camilla appeared flustered and defensive. The contrast between their usual composed public personas and their current emotional states was striking. "I came to wish you well before the ceremony," William said carefully, sensing the charged atmosphere. "Is everything all right?" Charles hesitated, not wanting to involve his son in what was becoming a personal conflict with Camilla. However, his frustration and sense of betrayal made it difficult for him to maintain a completely neutral facade. "Your stepmother has concerns about my speech," Charles said diplomatically, though his tone suggested the situation was more serious than mere concerns. William looked between his father and Camilla, trying to understand the nature of their disagreement. He had reviewed the speech himself and found it to be a touching and appropriate tribute to his grandmother. He wondered what could have caused such obvious tension between them. "What sort of concerns?" William asked, hoping to help resolve whatever issue had arisen. Camilla felt uncomfortable discussing their private conflict in front of William, but she also saw an opportunity to gain an ally for her position. If William could be convinced that the speech posed risks, perhaps together they could persuade Charles to modify it. "I believe some sections of the speech might be misinterpreted by the media," Camilla explained, trying to sound reasonable rather than controlling. "I have suggested minor revisions to avoid potential controversy." William frowned, recalling his own review of the speech. While it was personal and emotionally open, he had not identified any content that seemed particularly risky or inappropriate. His father had consulted him specifically because of his concerns about family reactions and media interpretation. "I reviewed the speech last week," William said slowly. "I found it to be honest and touching. What specific sections concern you?" Camilla felt increasingly isolated as both Charles and William seemed aligned against her position. She began to wonder if her fears were overblown, but her years of negative media experience made it difficult for her to let go of her concerns. The private secretary's voice came through the door again, more urgent this time. "Sir, we really must depart now to avoid any delays." Charles gathered his papers and moved toward the door. His decision made despite the ongoing conflict. He would deliver the speech as written, with or without Camilla's support. The years of careful preparation and his deep love for his mother's memory outweighed his desire to avoid confrontation. "I am leaving now," Charles announced to both Camilla and William. "The ceremony must proceed as planned." William quickly moved to support his father, but he remained confused about the severity of the conflict and Camilla's role in creating it. The situation seemed disproportionate to any reasonable concerns about speech content. As Charles reached the door, Camilla made one final attempt to prevent what she saw as a mistake. Her desperation and fear overcame her usual restraint, leading her to take an action that would change everything. As Charles reached for the door handle, Camilla moved swiftly to position herself between him and the exit. Her desperation had reached a breaking point, and she felt that physically preventing his departure was the only way to force him to listen to her concerns. The action was impulsive and born from genuine fear about the consequences of his speech, but it represented a line that had never been crossed in their relationship. "Charles, you cannot leave until we resolve this," Camilla said firmly, her back against the door. "I will not allow you to make this mistake." The phrase, "I will not allow," struck Charles like a slap. In that moment, he saw not his wife and partner, but someone attempting to control his actions as king. The irony was not lost on him that Camilla, who had suffered for years from others trying to control her image and actions, was now attempting to do the same to him. "Step aside, Camilla," Charles said, his voice carrying the full weight of royal authority. "You are forgetting yourself and your position." But Camilla remained in place, driven by a mixture of panic and protective instinct. She genuinely believed that allowing Charles to deliver the speech would harm them both irreparably, and her fear made her blind to how her actions appeared to others in the room. "I am thinking of both our positions," she replied, her voice shaking slightly. "Please, just give me 5 more minutes to explain why this speech could destroy everything we have worked to build." William watched this confrontation with growing alarm and disbelief. He had never seen his stepmother challenge his father so directly, and her physical blocking of the door struck him as both desperate and deeply inappropriate. The respect he had developed for Camilla over the years began to crumble as he witnessed what appeared to be an attempt to manipulate and control his father. "Camilla, please step away from the door," William said, his voice carrying a warning tone. "My father needs to leave immediately." Camilla turned toward William, hoping to find support, or at least understanding for her position. Instead, she saw disappointment and disapproval in his eyes. The realization that she had lost both men's support in her attempt to protect them created a moment of doubt about her actions. "William, surely you can see the risks involved in delivering this speech," she appealed to him. "You know how the media operates, how they twist words and create scandals from innocent statements." William's expression hardened as he considered her words and actions. While he acknowledged that media management was important, he could not accept the idea that fear of misinterpretation should prevent honest expression of grief and love for his grandmother. "My grandmother deserves a tribute that comes from the heart," William said firmly. "Managing media reactions should not take precedence over honoring her memory authentically." Charles felt a surge of gratitude toward his son for understanding and supporting his position. At the same time, his frustration with Camilla reached a boiling point as she continued to block his path while the clock ticked away precious minutes. "Camilla, I am ordering you to step aside," Charles said, his patience completely exhausted. "Your behavior is unacceptable and embarrassing." The word embarrassing cut deeply, as Camilla had spent years trying to overcome her reputation and prove herself worthy of her royal position. To be called embarrassing by her own husband, in front of his son, felt like a devastating rejection of all her efforts. "I am trying to save us from embarrassment," she replied, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Can you not see that I am acting out of love and concern?" Charles softened slightly at the sight of her tears, recognizing that her actions came from genuine fear rather than malicious intent. However, his responsibilities as king and his commitment to honoring his mother properly prevented him from yielding to emotional manipulation. "Your love and concern are noted," Charles said more gently. "But they cannot supersede my duty to speak truthfully about my mother's legacy." The private secretary's increasingly urgent knocking interrupted their standoff. The delay was now threatening the entire schedule of the ceremonial day, and security personnel would soon need to be involved if Charles did not depart immediately. "Sir, the delay is creating significant logistical problems," the secretary called through the door. We need immediate departure to maintain security protocols." William realized that the situation had become critical, and that decisive action was needed to resolve the impasse. His father's duty to the nation and the memory of his grandmother took absolute precedence over his stepmother's fears, however well-intentioned they might be. "Camilla, you need to move away from that door right now," William said, his voice rising with authority and anger. "Your behavior is preventing my father from fulfilling his duties as king." The strength and conviction in William's voice surprised everyone in the room, including himself. He had always shown respect for Camilla and avoided direct confrontation, but witnessing her attempts to control his father had awakened a protective instinct and a sense of outrage. "This is not about you or your fears," William continued, his anger building. "This is about honoring my grandmother and supporting my father in his role as king. Your attempts to manipulate this situation are selfish and inappropriate." Camilla stepped back as if physically struck by William's words. She had not expected such a direct and harsh rebuke from someone who had always been diplomatic and respectful toward her. The realization that she had damaged her relationship with both her husband and stepson hit her with full force. "William, I never intended," she began, but he cut her off. "Your intentions do not matter when your actions are wrong," William said sharply. "Step away from that door immediately, or I will remove you myself." The threat of physical removal by her stepson was the final humiliation for Camilla. She realized that her desperate attempts to protect their reputation had instead created exactly the kind of family scandal she had hoped to avoid. With tears streaming down her face, she moved away from the door. Charles immediately opened the door and strode out, followed closely by William. The private secretary, who had been waiting anxiously in the hallway, breathed a visible sigh of relief as they finally departed for the ceremony. The car ride to Westminster Abbey was tense and silent. Charles stared out the window, processing the morning's events and their implications for his marriage and family relationships. William sat beside him, still angry about what he had witnessed, but also concerned about the long-term consequences of the confrontation. "Father, I am sorry you had to experience that," William said finally. "No one should attempt to prevent you from honoring grandmother's memory." Charles nodded, appreciating his son's support while still feeling deeply hurt by Camilla's actions. The woman he loved and trusted had attempted to control him at one of the most important moments of his reign, and the betrayal felt profound. "Your support means everything to me," Charles replied quietly. "I hope I can count on it as we deal with the aftermath of this morning." At Westminster Abbey, Charles delivered his tribute speech exactly as written. His words about his mother's wisdom, forgiveness, and ability to heal family wounds resonated powerfully with the audience and the television viewers. The personal anecdotes that Camilla had feared would create controversy were instead praised as evidence of the late Queen's humanity and strength. Meanwhile, Camilla remained at Windsor Castle, watching the ceremony on television and experiencing a mixture of regret, embarrassment, and continued anxiety about potential media reactions. Her absence was noted by the press, who speculated about possible illness or family tensions. The speech was universally acclaimed as one of Charles's finest moments as king. The authenticity and emotion in his words created a powerful connection with the public and reinforced his image as someone who genuinely understood both the privileges and responsibilities of his position. Later that evening, Charles returned to find Camilla waiting for him in their private sitting room. The confrontation of the morning had left both of them emotionally drained and uncertain about how to repair the damage to their relationship. "Charles, I owe you an apology," Camilla said as he entered the room. "My behavior this morning was inexcusable, regardless of my intentions." Charles looked at his wife, seeing both the woman he loved and someone who had deeply disappointed him. The success of his speech had vindicated his decision, but the memory of her attempts to manipulate him remained painful. "Your apology is accepted," Charles said carefully. "But we need to discuss how this happened and ensure it never occurs again." William had also spent the day reflecting on the morning's events and their implications for family dynamics. He realized that his harsh words to Camilla had been necessary, but had also potentially damaged their relationship permanently. The royal family would need time to heal from the wounds created by fear, miscommunication, and misguided attempts at protection. The day that was meant to honor Queen Elizabeth's memory had instead revealed deep fractures in the relationships among those she left behind. As news of the successful ceremony spread, none of the participants could have imagined that their private conflict would remain secret. The true test would come in the days and weeks ahead as they worked to rebuild trust and understanding while maintaining their public duties and responsibilities. The morning that began with a disagreement about speech content had evolved into a fundamental crisis of trust and respect that would require careful navigation to resolve. The legacy of Queen Elizabeth, which Charles had hoped to honor through authentic remembrance, would ultimately be served by the family's ability to learn from their mistakes and grow stronger together.